Good morning, everyone. I'm Neil Fagan, and welcome to Forum. The Anti-Racism Committee and the Welcoming Migrants Committee have become aware of, there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric that is growing. And so we wanted to try to address that here. So our guest speaker today is Lori Chesser. Lori is an immigration attorney, and she's done that work for more than 30 years at the Dentons Davis Brown firm in Des Moines. She speaks frequently, both locally here, but also nationally, on issues about immigrants. So what she'll be talking about today is just addressing some of the misconceptions that are out there and helping us to think our way through those. And I think just before we get started, I think Mark has an announcement.
Morning, everyone. As you know, we have a delegation headed down to our sister church, Ebenezer Baptist in Havana, in a matter of a few days. And one of the things that the delegation is taking down there is greetings, of course, from Plymouth. So we have a table runner here, and there's also a tablecloth where they're having coffee fellowship, just to put your greetings onto that. If you'd like to do it in English, of course you all know English, but if you'd like to do it in Spanish, there's some translations here. It is their 75th anniversary as a church. The current happenings says it's the 75th anniversary of our relationship with them. It's really only the 10th. But they're big on celebrating anniversaries, so this is very, very special to them, and it's special to them that we have a group going down there. So if you we'll just take a few moments before you go into worship, or if you've already been there before you leave, and sign your greetings on here. So that's all I have.
Thank you. And
okay, take it
that's
away.
more to go. Take it away.
All right,
Lori.
can you hear me? Is this too loud? Loud enough? It is the mic. There's a mic. Lavalier mic, is that too loud? Is it okay? All right. Hi, very nice to see you all. Very nice to be here. Alicia Claypool told me a lot about what your committees are doing. It's amazing. I'm impressed. So I'm just going to take you through some things that I hope will help you to put this all in perspective and be able to understand better what's going on now and maybe where we can go from there. So just very quickly, I can't get through this whole thing in a half hour but I'll do my best, and I'll be glad to stay for questions or answer any questions. And I just want to be clear, we talk about racism, but no one's racist just because of their views about the immigration law. That's a very nuanced thing. We'll go through that here. And of course, this isn't legal advice, but we're going to go quickly, so hold on to your hats. So the first misconception that I often hear is that this is a modern problem, and however you describe this, we'll talk about that. But you think about immigration, all the controversy now, all the drama and all that kind of thing, and it just feels like things used to be better, but now they're terrible. Well, actually, immigration's been a controversial topic since the founding of our country. One of the reasons our country was, in the Declaration of Independence was the king wasn't letting enough people come. And we had during the first part of our immigration history, and I'm going to, go through this very quickly, but, we had this initial settler period where we had mostly people coming from the British Isles. Of course, some other variety there, but it was, pretty much a lot of homogeneity there in that first part of of people settling here. And the reasons people were coming then was basically, they were poor people who were ambitious. They needed to get land. They needed to, things weren't, in Northern and Western Europe, things were starting to change and they were being left out. So they needed a new place to go. And people are even willing to be indentured servants to come here and get land. But as soon as we started our country, we started regulating immigration. Even though we wanted immigration when we founded the country, we started regulating immigration. So you had this series of cases which and things that happened basically said it's federal law and, we can limit immigration at the federal level. From the 1820s to the 1880s, roughly, we had this period of mass migration, which is covered up a little there by that. But anyway, this period of mass migration, as they call it, where we started to have the settlement more in the Midwest. The Erie Canal opened up. We started to have those communities that we still have to some extent today. The German communities, the Dutch communities, all that kind of thing. But we had a lot of people coming, and the reasons were similar. They were just different parts of Europe. The same things that had been happening in Northern and Western Europe started to spread. There were still all these wars about territory. There was the Irish potato famine that you've heard of. And then there was more industrial development in the US. Also not to be forgotten is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which we annexed a lot of Mexico. And all of a sudden we had 80,000 former Mexicans who were now US citizens. So we had a lot of immigration there. Now, one of the things that happened during this period that started to become controversial were, one, Catholics were coming, which some Catholics always were here, but more Catholics were coming, and we didn't like that. And then we also really didn't like when the Chinese started to come to build the railroads. Now, we needed Chinese to build the railroads. It was a lot of work, and we even had a treaty, the Burlingame Treaty, to get Chinese to come and build the railroads. But we didn't like that when the railroads were ended up, being finished. And so we started to have regulation of Chinese immigration culminating in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, just to give you I'm going to not take a lot of time on this, but I thought it was just so interesting to hear this. So this is in California, so the Chinese ended up in California, and most of the Chinese were men, because that's what we wanted. We wanted men to work. Now we let, some women come, but it was mostly men, single men working, or maybe they weren't single, but their family wasn't there with them. And, to get to California, the gold rush, there starts to be competition. And so you start to have these politicians taking advantage of that. And so this one politician, Dennis Carney, this is part of one of his stump speeches. So he first goes on about how the elite, he doesn't call them that, but the elite are doing the bad things to the working people. And then he says, to add to our misery and despair, a bloated aristocracy has sent to China the greatest and oldest despotism in the world for a cheap working slave. It rakes the slums of Asia to find the meanest slave on earth, the Chinese coolie, and imports him here to meet the free American in the labor market, and still further widen the breach between rich and poor, still further degrade white labor. These cheap slaves fill every place. Their dress is scant and cheap. Their food is rice from China. They hedge 20 in a room, 10 by 10. They are whipped curs, abject in docility, mean, contemptible, and obedient in all things. They have no wives, children, or dependents. They are imported to work as serfs, work like slaves, send their earnings back to China. And so the father of a family, meaning a white family, is met at every turn. Would he get work for himself? Ah, a stout Chinaman does it cheaper. Will he get a place for his oldest boy? He cannot. His girl? Why, the Chinaman is in her place too. Every door is closed. He can only go to crime or suicide, his wife and daughter to prostitution, his boys to hooliganism and the penitentiary. So there you go, right? And so this letter is a part of a copy of a letter written in response to this became sort of a national thing from a person from China. And he says, in your Declaration of Independence is asserted that all men are born free and equal, and it is understood by the civilized world that the United States of America is a free country. But I fear there is a backward step being taken by the government. The able senator from Maine, who Blaine was the guy that was trying to get this Chinese Exclusion Act passed, is aping that selfish stump speaker, Dennis Carney, who I just read to you, says the Chinese must go and gives his reasons. The honorable senator calls us heathens, but I should judge from the tone of his letter that he was somewhat lacking in Christian charity. Let him look at the records of the fire in Chicago and the yellow fever in New Orleans, and he will find Chinamen giving as much according to their means as any other people. He says that people pay no taxes in this country. But I think if he will take pains to look into the matter, he will find that they pay as much taxes in California as any other foreigners. He says that China people are not healthy, do not keep their places of habitation as clean as other people, that they smell badly. I could mention several other nationalities, each having its own particular smell. Also, that no decent China women came here, that they are mostly prostitutes. But do not women of other nations furnish a goodly number of prostitutes? My idea is that if Chinese are allowed to come to this country and enjoy the same privileges as people from any other foreign land, they will educate themselves and conform to your laws and manners and become as good citizens as any other race. And just another little outtake here, he says, the Chinese must not be blamed that other men have no work. It is not their fault. As it stands now, it is 5,000 Caucasians to 1 Mongolian, yet you charge the Chinaman when robbing you of work. So I don't know. That was 1880 something. So you can see where things haven't changed that much. All right. So at the same time, 1883, right after we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, Emma Lazarus wrote the poem. As you all know, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So immigration didn't stop, though, with the exclusion of Chinese. People kept coming, and they started coming from different parts of Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. And so we had, different languages, some different cultures. And in 1890, New York's Lower East Side had the highest population density in the world. Just think about that. Okay. And so, partly it's better transportation, but a lot of it was just the economic changes that had happened before in other parts of Europe were getting over to this part of Europe. And so then, of course, more anti-immigrant sentiment starts to foment. And we have, this is one of the founders of the anti-immigration movement at that time, a lawyer, Harvard graduate. And then, of course, you start to get to, the politics of the anarchists, and, you're leading up to World War II. And it finally culminates in passing what it was the Johnson, now I can't read the thing, but anyway, it was a law in 1924 that restricted the balance of immigration to what basically the racial or national mix was in 1890. So in other words, going back to the halcyon days of 1890 to say who could immigrate based on where you were from. And so Herbert Hoover, then it even got worse in 29, they passed an even more restrictive bill. And Herbert Hoover, our friend, said, don't worry, the immigration quotas have nothing to do with politics. This is just the way it needs to be. Now, I'm not sure you can read all this, but basically, if you notice, most countries are limited to about 100 people a year. But, you've got some of the ones that were, people were here before, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, 65,000 people could come. And, that's how that all played out. And the restriction, by the time they passed that law that Hoover signed in 1929, they had restricted immigration to 150,000 people a year, an 80% reduction of who was coming before. All right, and of course, some people pushed back a little bit on that as well, saying if the Native Americans had taken this view, none of us would be here, right? At the same time, now, in context, let's think about this. From the founding of our country to the 1920s, we had no border restrictions in North America. So no border with Canada, like with Mexico, it was an unrestricted border, completely unrestricted, or Canada too. There was nothing, no policing for all that time, 150 years. But in this, anti-immigrant fervor in 1920s, they started to look at the border with Mexico and started to do Mexican repatriation. And a lot of US citizens were repatriated to Mexico during that time. And then, of course, we had, and I really do recommend the PBS documentary, the Ken Burns documentary, US and the Holocaust. The first session will go over a lot of this in some more detail. But, this is leading up to World War II. And of course, at that time, we're still in this anti-immigrant mode. And so we weren't really welcoming to the Jews fleeing, the Nazis, obviously, at that time. And then, of course, when World War II breaks out, that has a big effect on immigration policy as well. On one hand, we decide, well, okay, maybe Mexicans aren't that bad after all. In fact, they could actually come and work for us while we go fight the war. So we had the Bracero Agreement, which brings people from Mexico, men from Mexico alone, to come and work in the fields and in the industry and that kind of thing. And then we have the executive order that incarcerates Japanese Americans in the West Coast, okay? But after we fight World War II, of course, that does start to change things a little because soldiers have seen the big world, and of course, it also starts to change our economy. So the real restrictionist parts start to soften. So you get war brides, you get some refugee acceptance, and basically partly, a lot of because of the economy is growing, right? And the US is taking a different place in the world, but also because of this broader view, we eventually work our way to the 1960s when we're, doing civil rights legislation. And we decide that, President Johnson and some others in Congress said, what's really a scandal? Our immigration law, because it's still based completely on nationality, basically, we need to change that. So they start down that road. Now, very interestingly, although this turned out quite differently than, well, what should I say? Like the goal was good. It was to get, to make the immigration law not racist. But the person who ended up being the power player in the Senate was a Southerner who was very committed to the idea that we should not expand our immigration law to other races. And so what he fought for was keeping it mostly based on family relationships. Because you think about it, that's a great marker. If you can only bring your family members, you're going to bring your family members who are going to look like you, right? I mean, that was his assumption. And so that's what happened when we passed the big immigration reform. It was mostly based on family relationships, some based on jobs, some refugees. But that didn't work out, I'm going to go back, that didn't work out quite the way that he expected because, of course, Americans ended up not marrying people that looked like them, after all. And that has turned out to be actually the most diversifying immigration law that we had, was to have family relationship, as it turned out. Okay, then we did do also some, around the Vietnam War and that kind of thing. We did some specific things for refugees, and the wonderful history of Iowa, refugee resettlement and all that. Okay, so from that time to our next law, we're getting to the end of our history here, and we'll get to the present. In '86, we had a big immigration change. And the reason for that was that, think about from the late 60s to the late 80s, what happened in the US? What? Vietnam War was one. Technology. The technology revolution, the education revolution, the US just took off like a rocket. Our economy just went from, you just can't even imagine in those, 20 years how we changed. Other countries like Mexico were not moving as quickly, unfortunately, and it became this out of balance so that, the US people are getting, going to school, not wanting the labor jobs and all that kind of stuff. It creates this vacuum. People start coming mostly from Mexico, Central America, other places, but a lot from Mexico, to fill those jobs. And we get a big pool of unauthorized immigration. And so people are like, well, let's regularize this. Let's try to fix the immigration law, make it more, up to date. Let's legalize the people who are here. And so that's what we did in the Immigration Reform and Control Act of '86. And so you can kind of see over here, this is just saying how much immigration. You can see it started out really a lot, shrunk in the 30s and 40s, slowly moved up, through the 2000s. And that rise of immigration also really mirrors the rise of the US as a world power and the economic powerhouse. And those are not unrelated at all. Okay, so the next misconception I always hear is the system is broken. So I just want to tell you, when they made that change, and that basically is the start of our modern immigration system, we have a lot of immigration laws that actually work pretty well. We, depending on your views, what's working well. But the border went from 3,600 Border Patrol agents in '86 to about 20,000 now. You've got criminal penalties for using false IDs. You've got criminal penalties for smuggling. You've got, here's the Border Patrol budget, over the years, going up to like $4 billion, what was that, in millions, so like a lot of money, let's just put it that way. And you've got, a lot of border enforcement. You've got a lot of laws around that. You've got, reasons people can't come, a lot of reasons people can't enter the US. You've got interior enforcement. You've got reasons people can be removed from the US. And we won't go into all the details, but you can see we have a lot of rules about immigration now. We've also got the executive orders. I mean, if things really get bad, the president can just say, oh, let's close the borders, basically, which, happened during COVID and, that kind of thing. So we've got that. We also recruited employers to enforce our immigration law, because you can't work unless you're authorized. And so employers are now enforcing our immigration law as well. So we've got that. We did do this legalization, which ended up being about 3 million people. And then we did kind of reworked our immigration system. It still is largely based on family relationship, expanded some of the employment, have the asylum and refugee, and this diversity lottery, which is a crazy thing about, keeping our immigrant stream diverse, which I can tell you about more if you're interested in that. But what that has over the last, from '86 to now is, getting close to 40 years. It kind of needs an update. It's basically where we are. And so, this is an example of the waiting lines that have developed now for the family categories. So I know that doesn't make any sense to you, but until I tell you that F1 is unmarried children of US citizens. The F2As are the spouses and children of under 21 of people with green cards. F2B are the adult children of green cards. F3 is the married children of US citizens, and F4 is siblings of US citizens. And so if you look there, current means there's no waiting line. That's kind of because of COVID that happened. But in any event, if you look like, if you want to bring your your adult child, you're a permanent resident with a green card, you want to bring your adult child from Mexico, you had to apply in April 1st, 2021 to have someone come in October 2022. That's what that means. So that means that's when you would have had to apply to get that person here. Now, there's no limit on spouses of US citizens, minor children of US citizens, parents of US citizens over 21. There's no limits on that immigration, family immigration, but we do have these waiting lines. So there's a lot of demand, and you have to decide where you make those cuts. But that's one thing that has happened in the last 30 some years. And then the employment categories also, it's based on supply and demand, very, very low number of visas, like 140,000 a year. But there's not waiting lines in all the categories, but the categories here are based on how much education or training you need to do a job, basically. And so you can see there's a lot of demand from India and China. So there's waiting lines for those countries too, and things like that. So, it's not a perfect system, but it has some tensions. So that's one of the tensions, is that we have more people, we are sponsoring more people than can come, and these waiting lines, are developed. We also have this whole system of temporary visas that allow people to come and work, or be here in certain situations. Now, you can't just wait here while your family's sponsoring you, but if you have a job, you could wait here. But if you spent time looking at this, you would soon see that what we don't have is any visa for non-seasonal, unskilled, in quotes, labor. So we still have decided that we want, educated people to come here despite, and not that education's bad or whatever, but I'm just saying, despite our need for people to do labor, we don't have that in the immigration law. So we still are left with a lot of unauthorized workers. No big surprise. We do have a system for dependents to come. We do have a way to protect people who are here and their countries become in chaos for whatever reason, temporary protected status from several countries. And we do have the refugee and asylum system. But of course, even with all that, just like in our history, what is happening outside the US really affects what's happening inside the US. And although we are, willing to let in refugees and have people claim asylum, it starts to get kind of uncomfortable when that's happening, and then a lot of bad things are happening around the world and people are coming to our borders to claim asylum. We all of a sudden have, we have these tensions, let's put it that way. So for instance, the gang violence in the Northern Triangle countries, it's basically a war, and people are basically coming to claim asylum. I mean, they are claiming asylum, but unfortunately, that's a lot of people and they can get here, and so that creates this, tension. The same now, Venezuelans. Venezuelans are coming up through Central America, and that's a great on point episode that explains that I linked there. So, it does create strain. It creates strain on border communities. It creates strain on law enforcement. It creates strain on our, on nonprofits and things like that. But it's nothing that we haven't experienced before. It doesn't mean the system's broken. It just means that it's not exactly meeting what is happening in the world. And so, I can't remember what that is. Oh, so yes, because of that and because of COVID, we do have a big backlog in our immigration courts, the ones that, decide if people are deported or decide if people get asylum. So that is another big strain we have right now. So we certainly have strains, we have challenges, but I wouldn't say the system is broken. And in fact, when we say the system is broken, it usually makes people not want to engage and try to fix it, because we don't fix things anymore that are broken, we throw them away. And we get new ones, right? So the system really is not broken. Okay, the third misconception, I'll be real quick, is that it's all about the border. And the border is certainly a challenge, as we were discussing. And it's some of you have been there, it's in a really difficult place. But we really have to think about not only what we talked about of people needing to come, we kind of needing people to come because of jobs, but also just the changing nature of jobs. And so this is just talking about how more education, more, the things we were talking about there before is, changing the kind of work that we have. And some of these, I'll go through some of these, but the other thing we want to really think about is demographics. Now you can't really see this very well, but that dark red pyramid is what it was in 1900, I think it was, 1900, where you've got younger people at the bottom going up to a few older people at the top. And then if you go out to the 2050 as the projection, is the lightest color there, a lot of people at the top. And, there's some pyramidal shape there, but it's mostly getting straight up and down. And when you have a straight up and down demographic pyramid, other things happen that maybe aren't quite so pleasant if you start to think about those. So this is comparing 1960 to 2018 in terms of US births. This is comparing foreign born. And you can see how, if you put those two next to each other, they're kind of compatible, right? We're getting people coming who are filling in where we need people to fill in. Unfortunately, our law doesn't let everybody come legally, but that's what's really happening. All right, so it's not really just about people want to come up on the border. We really need to think more broadly about this, because the demographics are our future. And we have to think about not just the crisis now, but what is our future, and how are we going to be able to sustain our way of life, our population, help people, do well by doing good, all those things. the threat to national security, you know, I could go into this lots more, but if you think about what the real threats are to national security, it's not immigration or immigrants, it's, you know, the world is happening and people move, and sometimes, you know, it's not just immigrants that do this, but it's, you know, a geopolitical situation that we're in. Foreign-born have helped us by being in the military, have helped us in a sense of security by keeping our agriculture going. This is saying that according to the Economic Research Service, up to 50% of workers in crop agriculture are unauthorized immigrants. So, you know, we have to think about these things, about security in a larger context there. And that's just a graphic representation of the agriculture workers. Okay, and so where does that leave us? The final misconception is that the only way we fix this is winning at the ballot box. And I want to challenge you on that, because what we find has happened is that although, you know, we've had this long history, as we saw, of sort of, immigration being very much tied to nationalism, being tied to racism, but also being tied to just feelings of preserving. You know, you think about World War II, you think, well, the Depression was also happening. And so it's not so surprising that people weren't welcoming at that time, because they were hurting themselves, you know? And probably the same back during the Chinese exclusion. They felt threatened themselves. And so that's what's happened today. People feel threatened, and the American Immigration Council has done some great studies on the sacralization of views, and they're saying that both pro-immigration views, you know, an open stance immigration and a closed stance view to immigration, have become sacralized, meaning that it's become part of people's identity and something very hard to change. And so the people that have a closed stance view tend to feel disaffected from society and not like the so-called progress to them that's being made, how things are changing. People who tend to have a more open stance may have experienced discrimination themselves and feel like they need to be welcoming to people to help that. That's just one characteristic I pulled out from each. But, you know, you can read into this at the American Immigration Council. And so, you know, it's not just, you know, if we just talk about the ballot box, we're just talking about a power struggle for the rest of our lives and the rest of our whatever, you know, future. Instead, the American Immigration Council and others have come up with ways to try to dialogue. And the most recent one is this cultivating contact, which might be a really nice thing for you to look at doing. Ways to talk to people on the other side of issues and try to get to their needs, because the facts, you know, show that immigration is not really a threat per se. It's just that, you know, we need to figure out how to, you know, how we should react to the current situation in the world and in our country. And we need to understand what the other's views are and try to separate that from our own identities and people's identities, and really listen to each other. To get this fixed in the long run, at least is my view. And I know I'm Catholic, so I'm going to give you some Pope Francis, but, you know, I'm sure you can find this in a lot of religious leaders. But I love what he said here, just talking about authentic social dialogue as respecting the other's point of view, and admit that it may include some legitimate convictions and concerns, and that we have to be able to hold these tensions at the same time, and realize that they don't always neatly fit together, but that we can come up with solutions for the common good. And so I, you know, challenge your group to think about that a little bit, because I really respect the work that you're doing right now to understand it. But I think that that's the only way we're going to get to this, go from this power struggle up and down, immigration being sort of a batting back and forth between two sides, and realize that it's people we're talking about, it's people's future we're talking about, it's our future we're talking about, and there has to be a way to bring those things together to make a good laws for the common good. So. Oh, there you go. Awesome. Well, I didn't leave. All right. Good. So I didn't leave much time for questions, but I'm very happy to take questions or stay if you want to talk about anything. Yes.
I was talking to a refugee from Nigeria who wants to get his wife here, and he claims he has to show that he has $22,000 in a bank account before he can have his wife come. Is that true?
Well, so there is this public charge. There's this affidavit of support that you have to sponsor family or anyone. You have to be able to sponsor anyone you're sponsoring has to show that they can live here without basically going on welfare. So a family of two would be around $20-some thousand. It doesn't have to be money in a bank account, but it has to be either income or assets or a combination of those. But yeah, that is true that we do have rules about that. Yeah, yeah.
I was recently called at the Pride Center by two gentlemen that had arrived from San Diego. One had entered the country from Liberia, and they were looking for a community that would be support for this young man, because if he was sent back to Liberia and they found out he was gay, they would execute him. So there are major issues, I think, involved with this. And I was able, through Alicia Claypool and the Plymouth, to find at least 4 resources for them and was able to help them in some way. I was hoping to hear back from them, but they have not called me back. My second comment is that yesterday at a rally, a fellow teacher from Newton talked about getting a woman and her 2 children here from Ukraine. And they were going to have to pay lawyers a lot of money to make this happen. Is that often the case?
Well, okay, so, immigration lawyers do provide a service that people do pay for. Now, whether it's reasonable or not is another question. The Uniting for Ukraine, we have a special program for that to help Ukrainians, refugees come to the States, and the federal government has made that easier than for a lot of refugees to come. And there's humanitarian parole and that kind of thing. But depending on what's happening with that family and where they are and how they have to navigate the system, they may need legal help. And whether that's a reasonable cost or not is just hard to say, because lawyers, of course, aren't supposed to collude about their fees. So, someone might charge, $10,000 for something, and someone else might charge $3,000 for something, and is it a lot of money? I don't know. But there's, the federal government takes position you don't need an immigration lawyer to navigate the immigration laws, but you're welcome to get your own immigration lawyer if you'd like. And that's the position that they take. So I don't know, but it is true that sometimes lawyers do have to get involved, or like I wouldn't have a job. But I think that it's just, and there are a lot of pro bono legal services as well, particularly for refugees, like you found when you were looking for your Liberian, you were trying to help. So yeah.
Is there any hope for the young people who came here as a child? Who have parents who have a green card? You alluded to that in one of your presentations. I know of a young lady from my hometown who's just a phenomenal student and just has a fantastic future ahead of her. But at age 21, she has to leave and go back to India, and she's never really lived there.
Yeah, so there's two things there. Exactly. But because of those waiting lines that I showed you, particularly from India and China, what happens is children come along with their parents until they turn 21, and then they age out. And that means that they can no longer ride along with their parents. And so if their parents are in this endless waiting line and can't get their green card, their children then can't get their green card based on their parents. Now, it doesn't mean they necessarily have to go back. What most children do is, if they can afford it, most children enroll in school, and you can get a student visa as a college student. Some people get married, some people get jobs, but I agree, there's not a great solution. And a lot of people from India are leaving and going to Canada, immigrating to Canada, where it's much quicker to avoid that happening. There's a lot of problems there, but that is one of the real challenges of our law right now that we need to address, absolutely need to address. And there are some efforts to do that. So yeah, there's also, of course, the children who came undocumented, the DACA students, who have work authorization, but now they don't have legal status, and they're dependent on that DACA continuing. So that's the other child question that we have. Yeah.
Other questions?
Now, I might have been misinformed, but I thought years ago that if people married an immigrant, the immigrant was they were faster or they could get, but then I've known several that have been deported, who were married and deported. So what is the law on people getting married to an immigrant and the immigrant becoming a citizen?
Yeah, so there's no numerical limit on sponsoring your spouse. And so as long as your spouse is either not in the US or is here legally with a legal status or entered legally and then lost their status, you can immigrate fairly easily. I mean, it's still a process, and many people would say it wasn't easy, but I'm just saying, relatively speaking, you can immigrate fairly easily. Where what you're talking about with deportation is that if someone did not enter legally and then gets married, the marriage doesn't keep them from being deported. And so they can be deported. Now, there is a waiver available, but they have to, show that it's extreme and unusual hardship to the US citizen spouse to get the waiver. And that would waive this, violation, and then they could immigrate. But yes, it is true. You could marry someone and still they could be deported. Yeah. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you.
Lori,
Hope that
thank you so
helped.
much.
Yeah.